turn it over. I'm going to turn it over to our friends from OpenSky, Renee Fry and Craig Beck. Take it away.
Thanks, Anne. So everyone, I'm Renee Fry with the OpenSky Policy Institute, and Craig is going to be providing the presentation today, but I just wanted to take a minute. As many of you might know, I'm stepping back as executive director, and I just really wanted to thank Anne and Hannah for their incredible partnership over the last 10 years. And just thank all of you for attending and for following our information. It has just been incredibly rewarding, and really appreciate NAM's leadership on pulling together groups of folks to provide input on the ARPA funds. And I look forward to watching these presentations in the future. So I'll stick around in case there are any questions that I can help answer. And I'm going to turn it over to Craig, OpenSky's Senior Fiscal Analyst. Craig.
Thank you, Renee. I really appreciate it. Again, Craig Beck with OpenSky Policy Institute. And I would like to start by again thanking NAM as Renee did, and also thanking Renee for her 10 years of great service to OpenSky. We are certainly going to miss her. Okay, so wow, let's see here. So for those of you who may not know who OpenSky is, I'll just give a brief description about us. So our mission statement is to improve opportunities for every Nebraskan by providing impartial and precise research, analysis, education, and leadership. And then our vision statement, very similar, but just slightly different. So OpenSky will be the most trusted resource for identifying, analyzing, and communicating sound fiscal policy, where we advance equitable policy change that eliminates barriers to economic security for all Nebraskans. And we really focus on that all Nebraskans part here at OpenSky. So for today's presentation, as Anne alluded to, we're going to talk about what we see coming down the pike for the 2022 legislative session. So I'll start off with a budget status, spend a little bit of time talking about the American Rescue Plan, and then also spend some time talking about the debates that we anticipate occurring in the 2022 legislature. So, and I should mention, we will be providing these slides after the presentation is over. And then also, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box or the chat box, I believe, and Hannah will be monitoring them and asking them real time. So don't hesitate to jump in if you have any questions. So to begin with the budget status, you know, the budget is always an important thing, and OpenSky, we really focus on the budget. So coming into the 2022 session, it is a 60-day session, or it's the second year of the biennium. That means that it being a mid-biennium year, there will be no budget that's done by the legislature, by the Appropriations Committee, etc. However, that does not mean that there is not going to be an opportunity to allocate some funding. So in the October forecasting board meeting, we saw a significant bump in the state's projected revenues. In fact, over $900 million increase in our projected revenues for the current biennium. That's significant. I am going to go into some detail here in a bit about that surplus that we're projecting, and federal funds are really propping up our budget status right now, so I'll walk us through that. Another highlight that I want to point out is that from the November meeting of the Tax Rate Review Committee, which is just a statutory committee that gets together to essentially look at how our revenues are doing, we're seeing reductions in TIOSA funding. TIOSA funding is the state's K-12 education finance formula. And again, it provides the bulk of our state K-12 funding. So we're seeing reductions in that. Roughly $23 million for fiscal year 23, a $47 million reduction in 24, and a $51 million reduction in 25. These are estimates at this point. We will have more finalized numbers come January, but that's something that's on our radar and something we're going to be watching. Another thing that I wanted to point out with regard to TIOSA from the Tax Rate Review Committee meeting was that the committee said that the 5-year TIOSA growth was very low, and that's mostly due to growth in valuation relative to the growth in school spending. So we are seeing valuations increase, and we're also seeing school spending for fiscal year 21 a little bit lower than we anticipated. The legislative fiscal analyst has said that that lower school spending than we anticipated was probably likely largely due to ARPA funds coming in for schools. So again, we're going to touch on those ARPA funds here in a bit. But again, they're holding school spending down because schools are able to supplant their general fund with those ARPA funds, lowering their spending. And then the final thing that I think is important to touch on just from a global perspective of the budget is that we saw significant growth in the LB 1107 credit. So the LB 1107 credit was passed in 2020. It is a refundable income tax credit that is granted against a property taxpayer's general fund school taxes paid. That is a mouthful, but essentially the point here is that we saw a significant inflation in that credit due to a few economic factors that nobody really anticipated. So it jumped from $125 million in 2020, and it will be $548 million for tax year 2021. So continuing on with the budget, as I mentioned, the October forecast came in significantly higher. What that means is that right now, the fiscal office is projecting a $412 million surplus for fiscal year 23. And what that means is that that money is going to be available on the floor for the 2022 legislative session for legislators to appropriate. Now, I do want to caveat a little bit with this funding. So first off, the $412 million does not account for expenses that we know are coming. So the biggest component of that would be NAEP, the Nebraska Public Employees Union, renegotiated a contract. They increased their wages. Also, you may have seen in the news recently that the Department of Correctional Services also increased wages relatively significantly. So those salary increases are going to cost money that the legislature is going to have to appropriate come the 2023 session, and that funding will come out of the $412 million surplus. We also would anticipate that DHHS provider rates would be increased, largely again due to staffing and increased salaries. And then there will also be other deficits as well that come in that the legislature likely funds. So just to give a little bit of context, we are currently anticipating about $78 million of that $412 million surplus to go just to salaries and then the other known deficits that we have. So it does not include an increase in provider rates if the legislature were to do that. Provider rates, it costs about $1.6 million per percentage point that we increase those provider rates. So look for that $412 million to be closer to 300 or 315, somewhere in there, for money that is actually available on the floor to spend. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what that $412 million surplus consists of. So 156 million of that is what we call lapsed funding, and that just means that it's funding from fiscal year 21 that agencies did not spend, and therefore it essentially just carries over into the next biennium. By far, the biggest component of that lapsed funding was savings in Medicaid. I think about 120 million of that was savings from Medicaid. And we see that savings in Medicaid because the federal government, through its various stimulus packages that they've passed during the coronavirus pandemic, have increased their portion of Medicaid reimbursement. So they've increased their FMAP rates, and that has saved the state a significant amount of money. We are now seeing how much money that saved us in fiscal year 21, about 120 million, again, just from Medicaid alone. So my point here is that our current budget is propped up significantly by federal money. There's other federal money apart from those Medicaid lapsed funds that is contributing to our surplus. Just to give you a little bit of context, of the, I think, 5 or so programs that the federal government has passed since the coronavirus pandemic began, Nebraska has received or been allocated over $21 billion in funding. That is a huge amount of money relative to Nebraska. So if you look at that $21 billion, it equates to about 20% of our state's entire annual personal income, which is huge. And then it also, another way to look at it, it equates to roughly 2 years of our state's entire state and local tax collection. So this is a huge magnitude of money that has flowed into the state. It is certainly propping up our current budget status. It's great. However, we do have concerns if that money is spent for ongoing purposes, particularly for things like tax cuts or tax reform, as I'm going to spend some time talking about here in a bit. But I just want to get that kind of drilled down into your minds that, yes, there's a significant amount of money on the floor. However, a lot of it is due to federal funds, and those federal funds are going to dry up at some point. So when those federal funds dry up, if that money is spent for purposes that are either, tax cuts or ongoing, it could put us in a tough fiscal position down the road. So we'll, again, spend some more time talking about that here in a bit. The final thing I want to touch on this slide is the cash reserve fund. It is at a record level right now. It's currently sitting at about $1 billion. There's also a projected $475 million transfer that will occur at the end of the current fiscal year. That'll put us up closer to 1.5 billion if that happens. Again, this is record territory for Nebraska. It's a great thing. The cash reserve fund really is vital for protecting the services that we care about, particularly during times of economic downturn. So the current budget for the current biennium has relatively low budget growth. We're talking about 1.8% appropriations growth for the current biennium. The reason I mention this is because we are projecting 4% inflation for Nebraska in 2022 alone. So when you look at that low budget growth, particularly relative to that high inflation growth, the state's spending, is not keeping pace with inflation. So we could see that come back in the future. I think we're seeing it partially in the need to increase salaries for corrections workers, the state employees, and potentially provider rates. And then we are currently showing a $665 million surplus in the following biennium. This is really kind of technical, but essentially the point I want to get across here is that, one, it's projected. A lot can happen in the next couple of years that would make that surplus either increase or decrease significantly. Again, looking at those federal funds, knowing that they're going to dry up, knowing that they're playing a very significant role, we're watching this out-year projection. And then the final point that I would make with regard to the budget is that the Legislative Fiscal Office, along with other Nebraska economists, believe that there will be a gradual step down from pandemic high revenues last fiscal year. But again, because we are so propped up by federal funds at the moment, we believe, particularly if those funds are spent, again, in an ongoing capacity or cutting taxes, that there is a potential for a fiscal cliff down the road, which is something that we're going to be keeping a very, very close eye on. you have a question for me, Hannah? Sorry, you're muted.
Hold on. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Over what period of time must these federal funds be spent, and are they restricted funds?
Yes, so good question. There are restrictions on the spending. The ARPA funds specifically, which I will touch on here in more detail in the next couple slides, but the ARPA funds specifically will need to be allocated by the end of 2024 and then spent by the end of 2026. And again, there are restrictions on those funds. Okay, so on to ARPA funding. Just through the American Rescue Plan Act, Nebraska has received and or been allocated more than $5.9 billion. There was $546 million specifically for K through 12 emergency relief. There has been a significant amount, or relatively significant amount, of chatter that we've been hearing from various different legislators and other people about using these ARPA funds to cut taxes. So the current Treasury guidance stipulates that states cannot use ARPA funds to cut taxes. If they do, then those funds will be subject to recapture by the federal government down the line. However, there have been quite a few challenges to that provision in the Treasury guidance. In fact, there have been 6 court cases that were filed. Those 6 court cases, however, have had very vastly different outcomes. Some have been dismissed altogether. I believe at least one case was won by the state who was challenging this Treasury guidance. However, I just want to make it very clear that none of these court cases currently bind Nebraska. So from our perspective, what we would anticipate is the Supreme Court ultimately having to make a decision in the future whether or not these ARPA funds can be used to cut taxes. We certainly hope that the tax cut provision remains so that states cannot use these funds to cut taxes, because we know that these funds are meant to provide not only help for Nebraskans and other Americans through the coronavirus pandemic, but it's also a really good chance for us to make some transformational change here in the state. So we really hope that they keep that provision that does not allow states to cut taxes. The final thing that I would touch on this slide is that we also heard last legislative session some senators here in the legislature talking about potentially reducing our state's K through 12 funding because they have received a significant amount of money from the feds. Again, $546 million for education alone, K through 12 education. We're not sure if that sentiment will return, but it's certainly something that we are going to keep an eye on. Schools are using these funds for other purposes. We don't want to be cutting their revenue from the state at the same time. So a little bit about the ARPA funding process. So the first tranche of funds has been requested by the state of Nebraska. The ARPA allocation of these funds will be determined like the budgetary process. What that means is that the governor will draft a bill. The Appropriations Committee will hold hearings. Come this next legislative session, they will take public input, and they will utilize that public input then to draft a bill that they will take to the legislature. Now, those of you on this call may know that NAM held those listening roundtable sessions earlier this fall that drafted those recommendations in those 5 areas that Ann mentioned earlier on in the call. Those have been very, very helpful for legislators in determining where the need is for those funding. But again, we'll see those funds go through the budget process. So it's something that we'll be watching. Question?
Yes, we have a couple.
Okay.
Let's see. This may be too far of a reach for consideration of the high. Shorter term federal funding supporting Medicaid, but for people living with disabilities, know of issues for people living after brain injury, for instance, on Nebraska Medicaid aren't able to leave the state for long-term treatment or change of residence to another state that offers better supports. Could this be considered as a good use of federal funds towards Medicaid that could be used only as long as they have the increase?
That is a great question. I am not sure that I have the answer to that.
Okay.
We can definitely
That is
follow up
fine.
though. See if we can get an
Okay,
answer.
sounds good. Yep, sounds good. Here is another question. It's my understanding that ARPA funds must prioritize and in fact are pre-authorized qualified census tracts. Don't understand how legislators can talk about using them for other purposes, such as recreational lakes or reducing taxes.
Again, I do not have the specific
Okay.
answer to that question. I'm not sure if Renee wants to chime in, but it's definitely something that we can try to find an answer for and follow up with.
Sounds good.
Okay, great.
That's all I got right now. Thank you.
Okay, sure. So continuing with ARPA, the legislature held 2 interim study hearings in October, again, to gather public input. Those NAM roundtables were very helpful in those interim studies as well. For the local government funds, which through ARPA are allocated to local governments of varying different size, cities, counties, etc. And then some of those cities and counties, again, depending on their size, either get their funds directly from the federal government or need to go through the state. But the focus of spending those local government funds and then the process of public input that those local governments are taking to, to best spend and allocate those funds varies widely across the state. The final thing about ARPA is that there is also a significant amount of money through grant funds. Some of those grants have discretion, others are less discretionary. And then for the grant funds that are more discretionary, there are some agencies that are taking public input on how those funds should be allocated. But again, a lot of those grant funds are not discretionary. Okay, so moving on to the 2022 legislative debates that we anticipate. So again, it's a 60-day session, so certainly not as long as a 90-day, of course, but there is going to be a lot of debate and a lot of issues coming up in this legislative session, and a lot of potentially very contentious issues that are going to suck a lot of air out of the room. So the first would be budget adjustments, as I mentioned, and ARPA, of course, those are going to be huge. We anticipate a rehash of property tax caps and other efforts to reduce property taxes. I have a slide on that later that I'll go into in a little bit more depth. We're also anticipating some very polarized K-12 debates, including things like a critical race theory ban, health standards, some sort of health standards ban. We don't exactly know what that looks like yet, but we anticipate that something will be introduced. There's also an effort currently to eliminate the State Board of Education and pull the Department of Education in under the governor. That could certainly be very contentious. There's also school finance reform sitting out there, which I will talk about here in a little bit. And then there's private school funding as well, through various different, through a couple different mechanisms, that are being proposed that we anticipate. I'll go into those more in depth as well. Tax reform, various proposals would, seems like we always have various tax reform proposals that we're fighting. We're also looking at Convention of States coming up very early in the legislative session. And then, of course, prison reform and abortion likely to be hot topics of debate as well. So those property tax caps that I mentioned, last year we had a bill, LB 408, that was introduced by Senator Linehan. What that bill would have done is it would have capped political subdivision property tax revenue growth at 3% yearly. It failed to garner enough votes to advance. There were various amendments filed to the cap trying to make it more palatable for particularly schools. But our biggest issue with property tax caps is that they really would have penalized arbitrarily schools. So we found actually an issue in the bill that was not accounted for that would have hurt our equalized school districts and high valuation growth districts where, because of the way the TIOSA formula works, it's based on a district's resources, which includes its property value. So as a district's property value increases, the formula recognizes that the school has a greater ability to pay for its own K through 12 education, and then it reduces state aid commensurately. But then if you're capping the amount of property tax ask that a district can access from the prior year, then you end up with a situation where these high valuation growth districts are unable to access all of their property growth because they're capped. So we pointed that out. It really was the sticking point for a lot of senators. But again, we anticipate some form of this bill coming back in 2022. Again, these caps are arbitrary. They really don't get at the heart of the matter as to why our state is so reliant on property taxes. And then the final point here is that considering our current dynamics, with teachers leaving the profession in droves, schools probably having to increase teacher salaries significantly just to retain teachers and attract new teachers to the profession. And then our 4% inflation that we're projecting for 2022, a 3% cap would not have allowed schools or other local subdivisions, for that matter, to raise enough revenue to tackle these issues that they're facing. So very briefly, I'm going to go over a school finance proposal that is currently sitting out there. It's currently being worked on by Senator Walz, who is chair of the Education Committee, along with a superintendent and a couple other school people who wanted to bring a proposal to the legislature from the schools so that the schools are not just consistently out there playing defense on what is proposed with regard to school finance. So this is referred to as the Columbus Plan because it comes from the superintendent at Columbus, who largely pulled the people together to work on this plan. So the plan would do a couple of things. It would reduce the property tax ask of public schools by $715 million. 100% of schools would receive a base aid, is what they're calling it, amount per student, equal to roughly $1,100 per student. It would raise the allocated income tax, which is just a technical formula component, from 2.23% to 20%. It's something that districts generally support because it would increase funding to schools. I think that's probably the main point there. And then it also would eliminate net option funding. So our analysis of the proposal is that it would in fact raise roughly $712 million of state support from our current funding of schools. And there's a very disparate change in funding for districts, as I'm sure you can imagine, because we have districts of varying size across the state, ranging from 234,000 negative for Paxton to a positive $110 million for OPS. And I need to mention here that the proposers of the plan are working on a way to hold the districts who end up with a negative amount of funding under this program proposal, hold those districts harmless. And then it from our analysis would result in an average levy reduction of about 21 cents across all school districts. Is there a question, Hannah?
Yes, someone wants to know, what is net option funding?
So net option funding is a program that exists in the current state aid formula that allows students to transfer from the district that they reside in to a different public district. So as long as the public district that they're transferring to is accepting students from other districts, they assign a dollar value to the student transferring in, and then depending on whether they have a net positive number of net option students or lose a net negative number of students to net option funding, is how the formula determines how much money a school district gets for their net option kids. Good question. So here's some analysis that our education policy director, Connie Kanoki, did. Here's an example of a rural district. Under the existing formula, their property tax comprises about 76% of their overall funding, and state aid is just 1%. So that's the funding from the state. So again, very, very low state aid for this rural district. And under the Columbus plan, their property tax would drop to 67%, which would mean that the school would be able to lower their levy, thus reduce property taxes for their property taxpayers, and their state aid would increase to 9%. Here's the same thing, but for a very urban district in the state. Again, you can see the same trend. Property tax decreases from 37 to 22%, and state aid increases from 37% of their total funding to 52%. So we are very happy to see a plan that would dedicate more revenue to schools. We cannot stress enough how big of a role our state's lack of support for schools drives our property tax issues. Just for some context, we are 49th in the nation in terms of our state support to K-12 education. So any proposal that would put more money towards schools is something that we are in support of. Similarly, going back to that $412 million surplus that I was talking about earlier, we would much rather see that surplus go to education than things like tax cuts. But we do have a couple concerns with the sustainability of this plan if it were to pass, if they use that surplus funding to help fund the proposal for the same reasons that I mentioned earlier. Our receipts currently are propped up significantly by federal dollars. Those dollars are going to dry up. If we spend like we're going to have those dollars going into the future, there's going to be a problem. And then similarly, there's no new revenue proposed with this plan as of now. Now we understand the introducer and the proponents of this plan have tried to stay away from proposing revenue, as it's generally a topic of debate and can drag the other proposal down into more politics. But the plan proposes to use what amounts to a 0.5-cent sales tax from the state's existing sales tax collections, and then would require the state to match those funds. That would cost anywhere from roughly $350 to $400 million per year. Without a dedicated revenue source to pay for that, it's going to come from the general fund. And we know that not only does the general fund education, it also funds all of the other priorities that our state values, things like healthcare, Medicaid, etc. So again, we're very happy to see this plan, but without new revenue to help pay for it, we're a little concerned about its sustainability. Moving on to private school subsidies, we anticipate there to be a push to allow 529 or NEST accounts to be used for private K through 12 education. We also anticipate that there will be another opportunity scholarship tax credit bill. Opportunity scholarship tax credits have been the push over the last couple legislative sessions. These would provide a dollar for dollar tax credit to taxpayers who make a donation to a scholarship granting organization who then provides scholarships for private tuition, K through 12. So back to these NEST accounts. Senator Linehan had a bill last year that would have done this, LB 681. And our concern with this proposal that would allow parents of children in private K through 12 schools to utilize these NEST funds to pay for that private tuition is that it would undermine the purpose of those plans, which really is savings. They were set up and have been expanded over the years, but they were really set up with the initial purpose of helping to save for college. And they do that by providing taxpayers who make contributions to the plan. They give them a tax deduction for qualified withdrawals from the plan, and then they also do not pay tax on any of the earnings in that account. Under this 529 plan, our concern is that taxpayers could drop their students' tuition for K through 12, private K through 12 into the plan today. They could pull that money out tomorrow, pay the tuition. They would receive a tax credit, or excuse me, a tax deduction for that withdraw. And then we are concerned there that it's a slippery slope into charter schools, which we know end up draining funds from the public education system.
Quick question. Someone was curious about the trust that is proposed as part of the plan for sustainability.
Sure. So that's a good question. The proponents of the bill have mentioned utilizing a trust to put the base aid funding. So again, that base aid funding would come from the equivalent of a ½ cent of the state sales tax, and with an equal matching portion by the state. It would go into a trust. Again, it's all a plan right now, but our issue again is that there's no dedicated revenue source to help pay for that as of right now. And then I would say also with a trust, it's very similar to other funds that the legislature sets up. In fact, there's really no difference from other funds that the state legislature sets up. And so while the trust is billed as a way to protect education funding, if there's excess money in a trust and the legislature needs that money in a subsequent year to pay for other bills, there would be nothing that would stop. From my understanding, there would be nothing that would stop the legislature from being able to raid that fund. So again, our main concern is just that there's not a dedicated revenue source to help pay for the plan.
Okay, one more question similar. Wouldn't the 529 shift only help private schools? Charter schools generally don't require payment. They just shift funds from the public school account.
Sure. So I guess my point is that we're concerned that allowing the 529 plan could be a slippery slope into charter schools when you start allowing tax deductions for private tuition, private K through 12 tuition. Okay, so touching on the tax cuts and reform very briefly. So there's Blueprint Nebraska that's sitting out there. You know, in 2019, they formed a committee that went across the state and took input from something like 300 plus stakeholders, looking at what would truly grow the state of Nebraska. They issued a 15-point plan, very detailed. They focused on things like diversity, equity, inclusion, making Nebraska a better place to live. There was a very, very small portion of the report dedicated to tax cuts. However, the Blueprint Committee's first big legislative push is for tax cuts. It's not for the things that the plan said would actually help grow the state. The Blueprint would cut roughly 2/3 of our state personal income tax over the next decade. I do have another slide here. Again, it would phase into the income tax cuts, cut a significant amount of our personal income tax revenue, which largely funds the general fund. It would broaden the sales tax base, eliminate the inheritance tax. It assumes that there's increased revenue from substantial growth that would occur from cutting taxes that would be utilized to pay for property tax relief. However, we know that tax cuts do not happen in a vacuum and they do not necessarily grow the economy. So these are some of our concerns. We're also concerned that the modeling shows that the Blueprint actually released that most of the benefits of the plan flow largely to Eastern Nebraska. And again, we're concerned about the modeling, their assumptions that they make, and particularly related to growth. And we've seen from the past, and we've seen from myriad studies that tax cuts, do not grow the economy. There's also Senator Erdman's consumption tax proposal sitting out there on the floor. It would need a priority in order to come back, but we do anticipate Senator Erdman getting a priority on that bill. The consumption tax would remove all of the state's current taxes, property sales, income, everything. It would remove all of our current exemptions, and then it would implement what is called a consumption tax. It's similar to a sales tax, and everything that you buy new would be subject to the consumption tax rate. His proposal is 10.64%. However, the Legislative Fiscal Office has estimated that at the 10.64% rate, there's a $4 billion hole created annually by year 4 of the proposal. So our anticipation is that the rate would probably have to be closer to 15 or 20% in order to be revenue neutral. And then you're talking, the significant potential to alter behavior. Living in Omaha, I could drive 15 minutes to Iowa and buy all of my stuff not subject to the consumption tax. So we're also concerned that the consumption tax proposal would severely limit local control, which is something that Nebraskans hold very dearly. It would eliminate local control because it would require all local governments to seek their budget from the state, and then the state would have to determine, first of all, if the funding was even available. As we know, the proposal, as currently written, would result in a significant revenue loss, but it would eliminate local control because we currently elect our local officials who know our local needs, who are very judicious with our money, but provide the services that their constituents ask for. Is there a question, Hannah?
Yes, would food be taxed in the consumption tax?
It is my understanding that yes, food would be taxed. We know food is a very regressive item to be taxed. Part of Senator Erdman's plan to combat the regressive nature of the plan would be to provide monthly subsidies to all families based on their income based on the federal poverty level for the number of people in their family. Again, I think the main point is just that the consumption tax would be a radical shift from our current system, and furthermore, no states in the nation have anything like a consumption tax. And so it's really uncharted waters here, and it would be very radical, and we are very concerned about the effects that it would have on the economy. We also anticipate a corporate tax cut bill coming this session. That bill would cut roughly $42 million annually, going down to the rate that they would like to cut the corporate tax to. So again, we're talking about just taking money off the table, money that helps pay for healthcare, education, things that we care about, services that we care about, services that we fight for every day. There's also likely to be a proposal to continue or further the Social Security tax exemption that was passed last year by the legislature. Last year, they exempted 50% of Social Security income. This year, we anticipate there being a bill to further remove all, so provide a 100% exemption on Social Security income. That is a very, very costly proposal. A 100% exemption of Social Security income is expected to reduce revenue by $142 million annually. And then the final point that I would say there is that the Social Security tax exemption from our modeling flows mostly to high income seniors. And that would be the seniors in the top 20%. Prior to the current exemption and the proposed exemption, Nebraska had already exempted most seniors from paying tax on their Social Security income. So the remainder that we would catch by exempting 100% of their income is going to flow largely to high income seniors. Okay, moving on to the Constitutional Convention. So the Constitutional Convention would add Nebraska to a call for Convention of States. It would put our everything we hold dear in jeopardy, our most cherished freedoms, rights, protections, etc. We have a lot of concerns with the Constitutional Convention. You know, who would the delegates be? The proposal would seek to add a balanced budget requirement to the national level, and that could severely limit the nation's ability to respond to significant events. We know that it's politically unpopular, and because it's on the floor right now of the legislature, we expect it to be up very early, potentially as early as the week of January 10th. We're watching it. We're going to have a webinar on January 6th where we talk much more about the Constitutional Convention, so tune back for that. And with that, I apologize for the marathon there, the lots of information thrown at you, but Renee and I would be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Hey, Craig, I'm going to go ahead and answer those ARPA questions. There were
Great.
4 of them. Do you mind sharing your screen?
Yeah,
I want to just share a slide really quick. Maybe. All right, so let's see if you can see this. So there was a question about the qualified census tracts, and those are prioritized in the ARPA statute, but it doesn't mean that the ARPA funds have to be used for those purposes that are laid out. There are pretty broad uses, which you can see here, to support public health expenditures, address negative impacts caused by the public health emergency, replace lost public sector revenue, provide premium pay for essential workers, or investments in water, sewer, and broadband. So they do not have to use it for any of these purposes. For example, premium pay is specifically articulated, but they do have really broad latitude. I think the question also had to do with using it for lakes. I do think that lakes are potentially problematic, and the final guidance is not out yet. So we would have to look, and I think we can look a little bit more into whether we think it would have to be respent if it were used for a lake. It is currently, and Craig touched on this, it is currently prohibited that you can't use it for tax cuts. As Craig indicated, there have been some court cases with difference of opinion. So that do not apply to Nebraska as of this moment in time, but tax cuts are specifically prohibited as a use of those funds in the statute. So there was a Medicaid question about whether it could be used to support families who can't leave the state. I do think, again, just showing that previous slide, certainly I think you could make a strong case that that would address negative impacts caused by the public health emergency. I will tell you that I think in talking with senators, they are looking for one-time use of those funds because they are one-time funding. So I think that there would need to have be some sort of sunset, and the legislature may be a little bit concerned about they're hesitant to add new services that there may be demand to keep later. But again, under the letter of the law as ARPA is written, I think that there's a really strong case that it would address the negative impacts caused by the public health emergency. There was a question about whether ARPA might be used for increasing the number of healthcare providers. The NAM recommendations, Hannah had put that in the chat earlier. The NAM recommendations specifically do have a recommendation in this regard, and that would be for scholarships for those entering healthcare fields, as well as tuition reimbursement to increase the amount of tuition reimbursement that is going to healthcare providers. And then there was a question about shovel-ready, the shovel-ready projects. I don't know what the timing will be, when those will be announced. In the ARPA hearing, Senator McDonald did indicate that there was significantly more in requests than there was funding that was provided. He is making an argument for those for more shovel-ready funds to be awarded under ARPA. We can check with the Legislative Fiscal Office and see if there's more on the timing of those. But my guess is that that's the hang up, is that there were so much more demand than there was money that had been set aside. So I think I answered those 4 ARPA questions. And Hannah, I'm not sure what else is out there.
Yep. We had one more ARPA one. Can the governor withhold spending ARPA money?
So we had been hearing early on that there was a chance that the governor wasn't going to request the second tranche, but we have since heard that he will be requesting the full amount that we are entitled to receive. So certainly the governor wouldn't necessarily have to do it, but we have been hearing now lately that he will request all of the funding.
And then who introduced the consumption tax? What senator? Senator Erdman, I believe.
Yes.
Yep. And then one last question, I think right now, what is the Constitutional Convention? What is a Constitutional Convention?
You want to take that one, Renee?
Sure. So there's an effort, it's by a group called the Convention of States, where you would have to have enough states call a convention for the purpose of amending our Constitution. So the LR 14 is the resolution that is before Nebraska, and there is a concerted effort to get this passed in as many states as possible, so that enough states, and I think it's 36, Craig, is that right? Must have similar language, in which case Congress would be forced to call a convention for the purpose of amending our Constitution. And our concern is the language actually requires balanced budget amendment, which had a balanced budget been in place, that we wouldn't have CARES or ARPA or the infrastructure bill, or if Build Back Better passes. And so there is a lot of research that being able to spend deficit spend during times of emergency actually help us get out of recessions faster. And so that is our primary concern. We're also just concerned about a runaway convention, and given how fragile our democracy is right now, going into some sort of a convention at this time makes us nervous.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. We get a bunch of thank yous in the chat, so we thank you, and we are definitely sad to see Renee go, but excited to see what she has. Okay, and we thank Craig for being here as well. And I think with that, oh, we might have one more question. Is there any awareness of the reality of a constitutional convention passing?
I think at this point, a lot of folks are just like, it'll never happen. We'll worry about that later. So as Craig said, we are doing a webinar on January 6th. I hope the irony is not lost on anyone that we are having it on January 6th. But and we'll have an expert from Georgetown Law School talking more about a convention and what's at stake. And we'll go into some detail about the number of states that have passed these, and we're hoping to raise some awareness that way.
Okay, with that, we have a Renee Fry rules in the chat, and I think we can close it out. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and partnership and this excellent information.
Thank you so much, Hannah and Ann. We really appreciate you. Thanks for everyone
Thank you
for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.